September 1943. Camp Trinidad, Colorado. Dieter Bachmann stepped off the transport truck, blinking in the bright American sunlight. Around him, 200 other German prisoners shuffled into formation, exhausted from weeks of travel across the Atlantic, then by rail across the American continent. They had been captured in North Africa 6 months earlier. Since then, they had heard stories about what happened to prisoners. Stories about forced labor, starvation, mistreatment. Stories designed to make soldiers fight to the end rather than surrender. Now they were in America, thousands of miles from home, waiting to discover their fate. What happened over the next 2 years would shatter every assumption these men held about their enemies. The treatment they received, the kindness they encountered, and the relationships they formed would transform their understanding of the conflict, their nation, and themselves. This is the story of how ordinary American farmers showed extraordinary humanity to men who had been taught to see them as inferior. How small acts of decency in rural America helped reshape the post-conflict world. The prisoner situation in America was unprecedented. Between 1942 and 1946, over 400,000 German military personnel would be held in camps across the United States. This was more prisoners than America had taken in all its previous conflicts combined. The solution was to distribute them across hundreds of camps in 46 states. Large base camps held thousands of prisoners. Smaller branch camps, often located near agricultural areas, held dozens or hundreds. The Geneva Convention of 1929 established rules for treatment of prisoners. Enlisted men could be required to work for reasonable wages. They must receive adequate food, housing, and medical care. They must be protected from violence and humiliation. The United States took these obligations seriously, partly from genuine commitment to international law, partly from practical concern that American prisoners held overseas would receive reciprocal treatment. The result was a prisoner experience that shocked German soldiers who had been told Americans were weak and hostile. Dieter Bachmann's first meal at Camp Trinidad was roast chicken, mashed potatoes, vegetables, and apple pie. After months of limited rations in North Africa, the abundance seemed impossible. "We thought it was a trick," he later recalled. "We thought they fed us well the first day, then would starve us. But the next day, breakfast was eggs, bacon, bread, coffee. More food than we had seen in years. We began to understand that everything we had been told was wrong." The work program began within weeks of arrival. The agricultural sector faced a severe labor shortage. Millions of American men had entered military service. Agricultural production was essential for feeding both domestic population and forces overseas. The solution was prisoner labor. Farmers could contract with camp authorities to obtain prisoner workers for harvesting, planting, and other agricultural tasks. This system brought German prisoners into direct contact with American farmers in circumstances that would transform both groups. Hans Mueller was a 24-year-old former infantry soldier from Bavaria, captured in Tunisia. In October 1943, he was assigned to a work detail at a farm near the camp in Kansas. "We were terrified," he remembered decades later. "We had been taught that Americans, especially farmers, were ignorant and brutal. We expected the worst." The truck arrived at a farm owned by John Patterson, a 52-year-old wheat and cattle farmer. Patterson stood waiting as 6 German prisoners climbed down from the truck. What happened next would be repeated thousands of times across rural America in countless small moments that collectively changed history. Patterson extended his hand to Mueller. "Welcome," he said in English. "You'll work hard here, but you'll be treated fairly. In return, you'll eat the same food my family eats, rest when we rest, and be treated with respect." Mueller, understanding some English from school, tentatively shook Patterson's hand. It was the first time since capture that an American had offered a handshake rather than orders. Over the coming weeks, Mueller and the other prisoners worked alongside Patterson, his 2 teenage sons, and his wife. They harvested wheat, repaired fences, tended cattle, and performed the endless tasks of farm life. The prisoners were housed in a converted barn, comfortable and warm. They ate meals with the family. They worked hard, but no harder than the family themselves worked. Most surprisingly, they were treated as human beings rather than enemies. Patterson's teenage son, Robert, later recalled, "My father said these men weren't responsible for the conflict. They were soldiers who followed orders. He said we should treat them the way we would want American prisoners treated overseas." This attitude was not universal among American farmers. Some viewed prisoners with hostility, but many farmers extended basic human kindness to men who were technically enemies. The reasons were complex. Rural Americans often had less exposure to propaganda. They saw prisoners as young men far from home. Many farmers had German ancestry themselves. Most importantly, farmers valued hard work, and German prisoners generally proved to be excellent workers. By November 1943, Mueller had developed a routine: morning work from dawn until lunch, afternoon work until dinner, evenings free for rest or reading. The work was hard, but satisfying. The food was abundant. The treatment was fair. One evening, as Mueller sat outside the barn reading a letter from home, Patterson approached with 2 cups of coffee. "Your family?" Patterson asked, gesturing to the letter. "My mother and sister," Mueller replied in broken English. "They are well. They ask when I come home." Patterson nodded. "I hope soon. This conflict needs to end. Too many young men far from their families." They sat in silence for a moment, sharing coffee in the Kansas twilight. "Why do you treat us kindly?" Mueller finally asked. "We are enemies." Patterson considered the question. "You didn't choose this conflict. You're a soldier following orders. That doesn't make you my enemy personally. Besides, treating people decently isn't about who they are. It's about who I am." This conversation, and thousands like it across rural America, represented something profound. In the midst of a conflict defined by hatred, ordinary people chose humanity over hostility. The impact on prisoners like Mueller was transformative. Everything they had been taught about Americans was challenged by daily experience. Winter 1943 approached, and work patterns changed with the seasons. The relationships that developed between prisoners and farmers often deepened during winter when the frantic pace of harvest gave way to more measured routines. Friedrich Weber had been a tank crewman, captured in Italy. Assigned to a dairy farm in Wisconsin, he found himself working daily alongside the farmer and his family. The farmer, Thomas O'Brien, was third-generation Irish-American. His grandfather had immigrated in the 1870s, seeking opportunity and escaping hardship. "My grandfather came to America with nothing," O'Brien told Weber one frozen morning. "He was treated badly by people who thought Irish were inferior. He never forgot that cruelty. He taught us to treat everyone with dignity." Weber had grown up under a system that taught superiority of certain groups. Working daily with O'Brien, eating meals with his family, Weber's worldview underwent fundamental challenge. "In my country, I was taught superiority," Weber later wrote in memoirs published in the 1970s. "But this American farmer treated me better than my own government ever had. He showed me that the ideology I had believed was built on lies." Not all prisoners experienced such enlightenment. Some remained committed to their national ideology. But among prisoners assigned to agricultural work, exposure to American families often eroded ideological commitment. The food alone was revolutionary. America's agricultural abundance meant that even during rationing, farms had access to quantities of food that seemed impossible to European prisoners. Wilhelm Schroeder, working on a farm in Nebraska, wrote to his family, "We eat better here as prisoners than we ate at home before the conflict. The farmers complain about rationing, but they have meat, eggs, milk, vegetables in quantities I have never seen." Beyond material conditions, prisoners encountered American values in practice: freedom of speech, religious freedom, democratic decision-making. These experiences challenged fundamental assumptions about governance. By spring 1944, many prisoners had been in America for a year. Hans Mueller returned to the Patterson farm in Kansas. This time, there was no fear. The Pattersons greeted him warmly, and work began immediately. Over that summer, Mueller's English improved dramatically through daily conversation. He learned about American history, government, and culture from the Patterson family. One evening in July, Patterson invited Mueller to join the family for dinner in the house rather than eating separately. It was a small gesture, but symbolically significant. "That dinner changed me," Mueller later said. "I realized that these people did not see me as inferior or as an enemy. They saw me as a person. That recognition of shared humanity broke through years of propaganda." The community relationships extended beyond individual farms. In many rural areas, prisoners became familiar presences. They attended church services, participated in community events under supervision. In some communities, this integration caused controversy. Families who had sons serving overseas sometimes resented seeing German prisoners treated well. But many communities accepted prisoners as temporary residents who contributed valuable labor while posing minimal threat. The education programs in camps provided another transformative element. American authorities established educational programs teaching democratic values, accurate history, and practical skills. Friedrich Weber enrolled in every class available. He studied American history, political science, and English literature. "I realized that I had been educated in lies," he later wrote. The American educational program presented information and encouraged critical thinking. This was revolutionary for someone raised in a system that demanded obedience without question. By summer 1944, some prisoners had developed genuine friendships with American farmers. These relationships existed in tension with their prisoner status and the ongoing conflict overseas. When news reached camps of Allied advances in Europe, reactions among prisoners varied dramatically. Some celebrated secretly. Others felt despair. Some felt conflicted. Wilhelm Schroeder was working on the Nebraska farm when news of the Normandy landings reached them in June 1944. The farmer's family gathered around the radio. Schroeder stood apart, uncertain. The farmer's wife noticed his distress. "This must be difficult for you," she said gently. "Knowing your countrymen are fighting while you are here, safe." Schroeder nodded, unable to speak. "I hope it ends soon," she continued. "No more death. Then you can go home to your family." This compassion, extended to an enemy prisoner at a moment of American military success, exemplified the remarkable humanity that characterized many American responses. The overall pattern was surprisingly peaceful. Of over 400,000 German prisoners held in America, fewer than 2,000 serious incidents occurred over 4 years. The vast majority worked peacefully and interacted respectfully with Americans. By 1945, some German prisoners had been in America for nearly 3 years. They had worked alongside Americans through multiple agricultural cycles. They had formed relationships that fundamentally changed their understanding of the world. Hans Mueller had returned to the Patterson farm for a third harvest season. By now, he was essentially part of the operation. He worked independently and participated fully in family life. One afternoon in April 1945, as news of events in Europe reached them, Patterson found Mueller sitting alone, visibly distressed. Reports of what Allied forces were discovering in camps across Europe were beginning to emerge. "Is it true?" Mueller asked quietly. "What they are saying about the camps?" Patterson sat beside him. "It appears to be true." Mueller put his head in his hands. "I did not know. How could this happen?" "I believe you didn't know," Patterson said. "But now you do. The question is what you do with that knowledge." This conversation was repeated across America as German prisoners confronted evidence of atrocities. For many prisoners, the discovery destroyed any remaining loyalty to the system they had served. Friedrich Weber wrote in his diary, "I served proudly, believing we fought for something good. Now I learn we served something evil. The Americans who treated me with dignity were fighting against true darkness. I am ashamed and grateful." The approaching end of the conflict created anxiety among prisoners. They wanted to go home, but feared what they would find. Some prisoners expressed reluctance to return. They had found freedom and dignity as prisoners in America that they had never experienced in their homeland. Wilhelm Schroeder confided to the Nebraska farmer, "In your country, I am treated as a human being with dignity. In my country, I was a number. I fear returning." The farmer understood. "But your family is there. You must return to help rebuild something better." When Germany surrendered in May 1945, reactions in camps were complex. Relief mixed with grief, fear, and uncertainty. Hans Mueller heard the news while working in the Patterson fields. He sat on the ground and wept. Patterson sat beside him in silence. After a long moment, Mueller spoke. "It is over, but everything is destroyed." "You'll return to possibility," Patterson replied. "A chance to build something better. You've learned here that another way is possible. Take that knowledge home." Repatriation did not begin immediately. Many remained in America through 1946. The final months were bittersweet. In late summer 1946, Hans Mueller prepared to leave the Patterson farm for the final time. The family gathered to say farewell. John Patterson embraced Mueller. "You've been more than a worker. You've been a friend. I hope you help build a better Germany. Remember what you learned here about how people can treat each other." Mueller could barely speak. "I will never forget your kindness. You treated me with more dignity as a prisoner than my own government treated me as a citizen. I will tell my children about this." Similar scenes played out across rural America. Enemies had become friends. The repatriation of German prisoners occurred gradually through 1946. What they found was devastation. Cities destroyed. Economy collapsed. Everything they had known was gone. But they also brought something valuable: experience of an alternative system and commitment to building something better. Hans Mueller returned to Bavaria to find his family alive but living in rubble. He worked initially in reconstruction, but also became involved in political organizing, advocating for democratic principles he had learned in America. "I told everyone about Kansas," he later recalled, "about farmers who treated prisoners with dignity, about a system where government served people. Gradually, people listened. Thousands of returned prisoners brought similar messages. They participated in political development and advocated for democratic values." West Germany's successful transition to democracy resulted from many factors, but the experience of prisoners who had lived in democratic America contributed to cultural acceptance of new political structures. Friedrich Weber became a teacher, educating a new generation about democracy and human rights. "The Americans who held me prisoner gave me more freedom than I had ever known," he told students. "They showed me that government can protect rights rather than violate them." Wilhelm Schroeder maintained correspondence with the Nebraska farmer's family for decades. He visited America twice in later years. "Those years in Nebraska shaped everything that came after," he said during a 1975 visit. "I learned that people of different nations can see each other as human beings." The American farmers who had employed prisoners reflected on how it had changed their understanding of conflict and humanity. John Patterson wrote in 1950, "Having German prisoners work our farm was initially controversial, but those years taught me that our enemies are human beings much like ourselves. Treating them with dignity cost us nothing and perhaps contributed to peace." The long-term diplomatic impact was significant. German politicians and citizens who remembered American treatment formed a foundation of goodwill that facilitated post-conflict alliance. The contrast with Soviet treatment was stark. Of approximately 3 million German prisoners held by the Soviet Union, nearly 1/3 perished. Germans who had been prisoners in America returned with positive stories that influenced political orientation of the developing Federal Republic. By the 1970s, former prisoners began publishing memoirs. Hans Mueller published Prisoner in Paradise in 1972, describing his time on the Kansas farm. The book became a bestseller in Germany. "I wrote the book because I wanted Germans to understand that Americans could have treated us brutally," Mueller explained. "Instead, they treated us with remarkable humanity. This kindness helped defeat ideology more effectively than any weapon." Academic studies found that the program had succeeded beyond its practical purpose. It had demonstrated that even in violent conflict, humanity and decency were possible. The town of Camp Trinidad established a historical museum in the 1980s. Bachmann returned in 1985 for the dedication. "When I arrived here in 1943, I was terrified," he spoke. "I expected cruelty. Instead, I found respect. The years I spent as a prisoner in America were the freest years of my life until then." Robert Patterson maintained correspondence with Mueller until Mueller's passing in 1998. Patterson spoke at a memorial service in Bavaria. "My father taught me that seeing enemies as human beings is not weakness, but strength," Patterson said. "Hans was technically our enemy, but my father treated him as a neighbor. That choice made both their lives richer." The story of German prisoners in America demonstrates that even in the darkest circumstances, individual human beings can choose compassion over cruelty. The American farmers who extended kindness were not heroes in the traditional sense. They simply treated other human beings with basic decency in circumstances where cruelty would have been easy. That choice of decency over revenge had ripples that extended far beyond individual farms. It helped shape post-conflict reconciliation. It influenced the political development of West Germany. The German prisoners who returned home became advocates for democratic values and transatlantic friendship. They had learned through personal experience that the ideology they had been taught was false, that democracy worked. The legacy demonstrates a profound truth. How we treat those in our power reveals who we truly are. When Hans Mueller sat on the Patterson porch drinking coffee, when Friedrich Weber ate dinner with the O'Brien family, small acts of recognition were building bridges across an ocean of hatred. Those bridges, constructed from countless individual moments of kindness, helped carry two former enemy nations toward friendship that has lasted generations. The story reminds us that even in violence and division, human connection remains possible. That seeing the humanity in those we oppose is wisdom. That small acts of decency can have profound historical consequences. German prisoners who couldn't believe the kindness of American farmers carried that disbelief home and transformed it into hope. Hope that a better world was possible. Hope that different nations could live in peace. That hope, planted in Kansas wheat fields and Wisconsin dairy barns, grew into lasting peace. A remarkable outcome from a simple choice: to treat prisoners as human beings, deserving of dignity.